England tries to negotiate with the dead, not with prayer, not with medicine, with a wage cap. The plague has already done its arithmetic. Bodies gone, fields empty, workshops silent. Labour becomes scarce, and scarcity is supposed to do what it always does, raise the price. But power hates price when it's attached to a human being. So the Crown answers with paperwork sharp enough to cut the Ordinance of Labourers, then the Statute of Labourers. The message is blunt, even if the Latin is pretty. You will not be paid more than you were paid before the world started rotting. You will not take advantage of catastrophe. You will stay in your place. This is where our story begins, because this is the first lie every Renaissance tells. That rebirth is natural, that it simply happens after darkness. It doesn't. Rebirth is a fight over who gets to write the rules when reality changes. So, here's the big question we're going to drag through ash and ink. When a society is reborn, who pays the bill? And who gets to call it progress? The chronicles of later centuries love the glow. They praise Florence, perspective, marble saints, bright pigments. They worship the genius. But a Renaissance is not born in studios. It is born in shortages, in fear, in the moment. Institutions realize their old control mechanisms don't work anymore. The horror isn't only the plague pit. The horror is the response. Law used like a leash. Morality used like a mask. Because look at what Edward III's government is really doing. It's not just stabilizing the economy. It's attempting to freeze the bargaining power of survivors. It's trying to stop labor from discovering supply and demand. It's trying to turn living people back into interchangeable parts, after the machine has already lost half its parts. That's not medieval. That's timeless. Now, take one step forward into our own century. For most people alive today, the internet used to be a place, a destination, a big box computer in a corner, an hour after school. You logged on, then you logged off, and life resumed with its old textures, the kitchen light, the street noise, the uncomfortable silence that forces you to think. Then the internet stopped being a place and became the air. It moved into your pocket and started following you around like a second nervous system. And here's the quiet cruelty of it. The new studio is no longer a room you enter to study. It's a feed you carry, a permanent corridor where strangers tug your sleeve for attention every 5 seconds. Renaissance elites once built a studio low, small, enclosed, stuffed with books, maps, instruments, rare objects, not because they were quaint, but because knowledge was dangerous. It had to be contained. A door mattered. A wall mattered. The act of leaving mattered. Your mind could return to the world because your mind wasn't being rented out by default. Today, the door is gone, and AI is about to remove the last remaining friction. Because if the plague made labor scarce, is making output infinite. Infinite text, infinite images, infinite content. And when everything can be manufactured, the only thing that becomes expensive again is the unsimulated human. Attention that isn't captured, speech that isn't polished, art that isn't predicted. That's the coming status symbol, not the newest device, but the refusal to be carried by a device at all. But power will not watch you walk away without rewriting the rules. So, part 1 ends where every Renaissance truly begins, not in beauty, but in negotiation. In a society asking, through law, through money, through fear, whether the future belongs to human beings or to the systems that learned how to own them. If you want to understand why the 2030s might feel like a renaissance, stop staring at the skyline of innovation and look at the smallest rooms in history, not cathedrals, not palaces, rooms with doors that close. In Renaissance Italy, the studiolo wasn't a cute aesthetic choice. It was a technology of attention, a deliberate enclosure built by people who understood a brutal truth. Knowledge can't grow in a crowd. It needs silence, scarcity, and control. 3 things modern life has declared immoral. Take Francesco I de' Medici, a ruler with money, bloodlines, and the kind of power that lets you turn entire neighborhoods into your personal statement. And what does he build for himself? A tiny hideaway stuffed with instruments, maps, specimens, oddities, objects pulled from trade routes, colonial extraction, and the early machinery of empire. And then he wraps it in myth, Prometheus, gods, and nature. A ceiling that tells you discovery is sacred, not mundane. But here's the part people skip because it ruins the romance. The studiolo is also a gate, a private room, a controlled archive. It's a declaration that truth is not for everyone at the same time. That is the Renaissance contradiction in miniature. Humanism preached back to the sources, but the sources still sat behind doors. The modern world pretends it solved this. Everything is accessible. Knowledge is democratized. But we replaced the locked door with something worse, a door that never closes. We didn't free attention. We auctioned it off in microseconds. The internet used to be a trip. You went there. You returned. You could feel your brain shifting gears, like stepping from a street into a library. Now the library is strapped to your hand and it screams at you. The feed doesn't just deliver information. It performs a ritual of soft control. It teaches you that silence is waste, that boredom is a moral failure, that every spare moment should be filled with someone else's thoughts. And that's where the violence is. Not the obvious violence. No blood on the screen. The slow violence. Your mind turned into a transit station. Renaissance elites paid for concentration because concentration was expensive. Paper cost money. Books were rare. Instruments were painstakingly made. Time was fought over, not assumed. The logistics of learning were physical. You needed a desk, light, ink, and the patience to sit with difficulty. Knowledge had friction, and friction is what made it real. Today, we've removed friction like it's an enemy. One tap, one scroll, infinite pages without turning a page, infinite insights without doing the work that produces insight. And now AI arrives like a machine, built specifically to complete the cycle, to generate the feeling of understanding without the burden of thinking. It will fill the world with answers, fluent, confident, safe, until words themselves start to feel cheap. So the studiolo returns, not as a nostalgia prop, but as a survival strategy. Because the real function of the studiolo wasn't just study, it was containment. It forced a boundary between the mind and the market. You entered it with intention. You left it with intention. You couldn't carry it into dinner. You couldn't consult it in bed. You couldn't let it colonize every awkward pause in your day. the room imposed a limit, and limits are what make choices meaningful. This is why the script's prediction hits harder than it sounds. The status symbol of the 2030s might not be the newest phone. It might be the absence of one. Not because technology is evil, but because omnipresent technology becomes a landlord. It charges rent in attention. It raises the rent every year. And it punishes you when you stop paying. Through anxiety, FOMO, social penalties, professional penalties, even the subtle fear that if you are not reachable, you don't exist. That's not a personal weakness. That's policy by design. Platforms are engineered as permanent occupancy. Notifications are not features. They are the bell that keeps peasants in the field. They create the sensation that you're always behind, always failing, always needing to catch up. And when AI can generate infinite content tailored to your tastes, your vulnerabilities, your politics, your cravings, then the feed doesn't just entertain you. It trains you. It becomes the scholastic textbook, the confessor, the tavern rumour, and the king's proclamation all at once. And here comes the uncomfortable Renaissance parallel. The moment people start building private rooms again, power will notice. Because a door that closes is an act of rebellion. A person who can sit in silence is harder to manipulate. A person who can read slowly is harder to panic. A person who can make something, bad poetry, clumsy music, flawed art, is less dependent on the machine's dopamine ration. But the Renaissance also teaches the dark flip side. Enclosures can liberate, and enclosures can imprison. Studioli were sanctuaries for some, and proof of exclusion for others. Who gets a quiet room? Who gets time? Who gets to disconnect without losing their job, their friends, their safety? Because if the 2030s really are a renaissance of boundaries, the next war won't be fought over information. It'll be fought over who is allowed to be unreachable. And the moment you ask for a door, you also have to ask the dangerous question. When the world demands constant access to you, who benefits from your permanent openness? And who will try to build the locks? The Renaissance did not begin with beauty. It began with disgust. Disgust at second-hand truth. Disgust at a world where knowledge came pre-chewed, pre-approved, filtered through layers of commentary until the original text was barely visible. The humanists had a phrase for their rebellion. At fontes, back to the sources. It sounds noble now, like a motto you embroider on a tote bag. But in practice, it was a threat. Because going to the sources means you stop needing the middlemen who built careers, fortunes, and authority on being the middle. That is why it matters that Petrarch, one of the fathers of this movement, did something that looks almost unhinged if you read it with modern eyes. He wrote a letter to Cicero, not about Cicero, to him, as if the dead man could still hear, still answer, still correct the century of noise that had piled up between them. It was a confession of hunger, the need for contact with something unmediated, something not padded with safe explanations. Petrarch wasn't just chasing information, he was chasing a feeling that the world had lost, directness. Now look at us. Our age is drowning in commentary. Reaction videos, quote tweets, stitched clips, summary threads. A guy watching a guy watching a guy. Everyone is an interpreter. Nobody is accountable for the source. This isn't harmless entertainment. It is a social structure. It trains you to outsource your judgment. It teaches you to wait for the approved reaction before you decide what you saw. And that is exactly why the appetite is shifting. People like to say younger generations are shallow because they consume endless content. But what's actually happening is stranger. They're developing an allergy to intermediaries. They want the source, raw footage, uncut clips, first-hand experience. That's why livestream culture exploded, because it felt like reality without the priesthood. Not a polished report, not a studio package. A person, in real time, unspooling the moment. But here's the trap. Raw doesn't mean true. It just means less edited. The tavern rumor never needed editing either. In the Middle Ages, most people didn't get truth from books. They got it from a man in a tavern who heard it from another man in a tavern. And by the time it reached you, it carried the fingerprints of fear, gossip, and desire. We tell ourselves we escaped that with literacy and printing. But the first centuries of print were not an instant upgrade. They were an information detonation. Pamphlets, tracts, competing claims, wild accusations, and wars where truth was a weapon wielded by anyone who could afford ink. Sound familiar? This is why the hunger for sources is about to sharpen into something harsher. Because AI is entering the room like a counterfeiter who doesn't sleep. It can generate infinite sources, infinite screenshots, infinite clips, infinite voices that sound like witnesses. And the psychological danger isn't that people will be fooled once. It's that people will be exhausted into surrender. When everything can be faked, the mind starts to protect itself by refusing to believe anything at all. That is how propaganda wins in the long run, not by proving lies, but by poisoning the very appetite for proof. So the 2030s question isn't, will people go back to the sources? They will. They already are. The real question is what counts as a source when sources can be manufactured at scale, when a fake can arrive faster than verification, when an algorithm can feed you evidence tailored to your politics, your grudges, your private shame, when your feed becomes a private court of law where you are judge and jury and also the defendant. This is where power returns to the story, because power loves nothing more than a public that cannot agree on reality. A fractured society is easier to sell to, easier to scare, easier to herd into solutions that just happen to increase surveillance, centralize authority, and punish dissent. In history, information floods don't simply create enlightenment. They create opportunities, especially for anyone willing to sell certainty. And certainty is always for sale. That's why the Renaissance, back to the sources, wasn't just a cultural movement. It was an institutional threat. Once people demanded originals, Greek manuscripts, Roman letters, direct readings. Someone had to decide which originals were authentic. Someone had to build libraries, catalogues, methods, reputations. New gatekeepers replaced old ones. The system changed, but the game remained. Whoever controls access and verification controls the future. Now we're standing at that same threshold. Except the flood is larger, faster, and personalized. Your public sphere isn't public anymore. It's an individually curated reality tunnel. And AI will make that tunnel smoother, warmer, more persuasive. It will give you sources that agree with you. It will give you enemies that feel undeniable. It will give you a world that feels coherent, at the cost of being real. So yes, Ad Fontes is coming back, but not as a cute return to authenticity, as a panic response, as triage, as a last attempt to keep the human mind from being rented out to the highest bidder. The plot turn is this: the demand for the source will not save us by itself, because in the next decade, the source may be the easiest thing to forge. And when the raw becomes fake, what do people cling to next? Proof, authority, or the comfort of a lie that finally feels stable? Here's the part nobody tells you when they romanticize the Renaissance. The humanists weren't only chasing beauty. They were running from a machine. Not a machine of gears and steam, a machine of language. In the late Middle Ages, the highest intellectual prestige belonged to a method: scholasticism. It was a way of thinking designed to do one thing obsessively well: take contradictions, break them apart, and force them into categories until the world looked solved. It produced real brilliance. It built universities. It gave Europe an apparatus for argument that could survive centuries. And yes, one of its giants, Thomas Aquinas, used that apparatus to weld Aristotle to Christian theology with such confidence it still echoes in classrooms today. So don't misunderstand me. Scholasticism wasn't stupid. It was powerful. That's exactly why it became dangerous when it ran out of oxygen. By the late 1400s, the machine starts to feel like it's eating itself. Questioned, objection, reply, counter-reply, books arguing with books, authorities citing authorities, logic chasing logic until the living world disappears behind footnotes. Later generations mock it with that infamous meme about angels on the head of a pin. Not because medieval scholars literally spent their lives counting celestial dancers, but because the image is perfect. A system so skilled at precision that it forgets the point of truth is not to win an argument, but to understand a life. And the humanists looked at that closed loop and said, enough. Go back to the sources. Go back to the world. Go back to the human voice underneath the procedure. Now, step into our present and tell me you don't recognize the feeling. AI is scholasticism reborn, except faster, cheaper, and everywhere at once. A large language model doesn't think the way you think. It predicts. It compresses oceans of human writing into patterns, then outputs the statistically likely next sentence. It's breathtaking. It's useful. It can draft emails, summarize meetings, write essays, generate scripts, and fill your screen with a confident voice that sounds like knowledge. But here's the horror. Fluency is not understanding, and certainty is not truth. Scholasticism at its worst created a false sensation of completion. The form itself, structured argument, authoritative citations, airtight logic, made people feel safe. It let them believe they were near God because the page was neat. AI offers the same drug, scaled to billions. A perfectly formatted answer with the messiness removed. No hesitation, no sweat, no embarrassment, no slow wrestling with ambiguity, just output. That's why this moment is not mainly about jobs. Jobs are the obvious headline. The deeper shift is psychological. A culture trained to accept language as a substitute for reality. Because once AI can produce endless text, the value of generic speech collapses. Corporate English collapses first, because that language was already half automatic. Circle back. Touch base. We take these allegations seriously. It's the dialect of safe emptiness. And AI is its perfect speaker, not because it's evil, but because it was built to be plausible and non-committal in exactly the way institutions demand. So the sane human response becomes predictable. We will flee toward what the machine can't fake without leaving fingerprints. Imperfection, specificity, risk. A real person stumbles, contradicts themselves, changes their mind mid-sentence. A real artist makes a choice that isn't optimal. A real thinker sits with discomfort instead of smoothing it into a neat paragraph. The machine can imitate the appearance of this, throw in a few ums, sprinkle in a regional phrase, but it can't live the cost of it. It can't stake its reputation. It can't lose sleep. It can't bleed. And that's why the next conflict is going to look cultural. But it's actually about power. Because institutions love text that can be standardized. They love language that can be audited. They love speech that doesn't surprise anyone. When AI becomes the default writer of public reality, press releases, curriculum, policy summaries, news scripts, the world starts to feel like one long antiseptic hallway with no doors. Everything smooth, everything safe, everything impossible to trust. And in that environment, the people who refuse the machine, who speak like humans, who make things by hand, who build boundaries around attention, become a threat. Not a moral threat, a logistical one. They are harder to herd, harder to monetize, harder to predict. That's the plot turn. The Renaissance didn't defeat the scholastic machine by being smarter. It defeated it by changing what counted as intelligence. So the question you should be asking now isn't, will AI replace us? The darker question is, when the world is flooded with perfect answers, will we still have the patience to ask real questions? Or will we accept the machine's neatness as the new god? If you strip the romance off history, the Black Death looks less like a medieval horror story and more like a brutal economic lesson taught with corpses. Before the plague, labor was cheap because people were abundant. Not cheap in the polite sense, cheap in the way you treat a replaceable part. A peasant dies, another takes his place. A farmhand refuses, someone hungrier will accept. That is the quiet engine of feudalism, a surplus of bodies trapped on land they don't own, under rules they didn't write, paying rent to a lord who calls it order. Then the pestilence arrives like a guillotine for the labor market. Villages thin out, fields go unplowed, workshops lose their hands. The system discovers overnight that it cannot function without the people it has spent centuries teaching to feel disposable. This is what scarcity does. It turns the invisible into the indispensable. And for a brief moment, just a brief moment, survivors taste leverage. They begin to move. They begin to ask for wages that match the risk of living in a world where death can enter through the breath. They begin to recognize something almost obscene in its simplicity. If you cannot replace me, you must bargain with me. That is the true plague mechanism. Not the disease itself, the inversion it forces in the negotiation between the governed and the governing. So power does what power always does when the market stops obeying its moral story. It legislates. It writes reality down and pretends ink can stop hunger. the Ordinance of Labourers, then the Statute of Labourers, tries to staple the future to the past. It tells workers they are not allowed to charge more, not allowed to move freely, not allowed to take advantage of the crisis. Because when the poor bargain, the rich suddenly discover ethics. The state frames it as stability. It frames it as fairness. But read the bones under the rhetoric. It is an attempt to criminalize scarcity when scarcity empowers the wrong people. This is why I began this series with a ledger. Because law is not just punishment. Law is bookkeeping. It decides which suffering is disorder and which suffering is necessary. It sets the price of a life and then calls that price virtue. And it doesn't even work the way the lawmakers want. You can threaten a starving man with prison, but you cannot force a dead village to produce a living workforce. Enforcement becomes a game of whack-a-mole. Wages rise anyway, unevenly, illegally, sometimes violently. The old hierarchy survives, but it no longer feels inevitable. The peasants have seen the trick. They have seen that the natural order was always a negotiation disguised as destiny. Now, take that mechanism and slide it into our own decade. Because AI is not a plague of bodies. It's a plague of output. For 30 years, we built an economy around repetition. Emails, reports, summaries, generic marketing copy, customer support scripts, spreadsheet drudgery. Entire careers devoted to moving information from one box to another, then congratulating ourselves for productivity. It was feudalism with better chairs, open plan serfdom, fluorescent lit obedience, constant measurement, constant busyness, very little ownership. And then AI arrives with an endless shovel of text, images, and content, dumping it into the marketplace until the price of the generic collapses. This is where people get the story wrong. They think the horror is replacement. But replacement is only Act 1. The deeper shift is revaluation. When a machine can produce infinite competent-looking work, the value of competence alone evaporates. The world stops paying for can write. It stops paying for can summarize. It stops paying for can produce something that looks like a human did it. So what becomes scarce? Not information, not output, not even talent in the broad, flattened sense. Scarcity moves to the one thing the machine cannot manufacture without revealing itself. Unsimulated humanity, presence, trust, taste that costs something, judgment that risks being wrong, work that carries fingerprints, specificity, local knowledge, emotional consequence, lived context, a voice that has a history behind it. And that sounds hopeful, until you notice what scarcity does under capitalism. Scarcity becomes a luxury market. If real humanity becomes rare, it doesn't automatically become respected. It becomes monetized. It becomes gate-kept. It becomes a product tier. Pay extra for human support. Subscribe for authentic creators. Upgrade for verified reality. The same way the plague gave workers bargaining power, but also provoked a legal backlash, AI may elevate human craft, while simultaneously building new systems to control who is allowed to be human in public. This is the psychological battleground the 2030s will be built on. Because when people feel their work is devalued, they panic. They cling to credentials. They cling to institutions. They cling to anything that promises stable meaning. And power will offer stability in exchange for obedience, the way it always has. New licenses, new verification regimes, new trust badges, new gatekeepers, new punishments for those who refuse the approved channels. The Black Death didn't end feudalism overnight. It cracked the spell. It made people see that the system could be negotiated with, if you could survive the retaliation. So here's the open loop we carry into the next part. If AI creates a world where the generic is worthless and the human is scarce, will scarcity finally give ordinary people leverage? Or will it simply create a premium market where only the protected and wealthy are allowed to live authentically, while everyone else is pushed back into cheap, compliant, machine-shaped life? We tell a comforting fairy tale about technology. A new tool arrives, knowledge spreads, ignorance retreats, and everyone becomes more reasonable. History laughs at that. When the printing press begins to bite into Europe, it doesn't produce instant enlightenment. It produces an explosion, an information wildfire in a world that has no fire department. Suddenly, texts can multiply faster than institutions can control them. Suddenly, an idea doesn't have to die in a single monastery library. It can replicate. It can travel. It can recruit. And once you can print, the question stops being, is this true? And becomes, can this spread? That is not a minor shift. That is a change in the physics of reality. Before, authority was slow. It moved by hand, by memory, by voice, by the weight of tradition. Then ink begins to move like a plague. Pamphlets, tracts, sermons, accusations, counter-accusations. Competing sources, competing witnesses. The early modern world doesn't become calmer because more people can read. It becomes more paranoid because more people can publish. And this is the part modern audiences hate, because it ruins the myth that more information equals more truth. More information often means more weapons. The printing press doesn't just make new knowledge possible, it makes new kinds of fraud possible, new kinds of persuasion, new kinds of panic. A lie with a printing press behind it looks like legitimacy. A rumor printed in neat type feels like it deserves belief. A forged document becomes more dangerous not because it's smarter, but because it's reproducible. This is why some historians argue the press forces societies to evolve, not morally, but structurally. When the flood arrives, you either develop methods to separate signal from noise, or you drown. Catalogues, standardized editions, citation practices, reputations, institutions that certify, communities of experts that argue publicly instead of whispering in private. None of this emerges because humans suddenly become virtuous. It emerges because chaos becomes too expensive to tolerate. The ugly truth is that verification is usually born from pain, and now we're doing it again. AI is our printing press moment, but with two differences that should terrify you if you're honest. First, speed. Second, personalization. The press produced floods that were public. Everyone could at least argue over the same pamphlet. AI produces floods that are tailored. Your feed is not my feed. Your evidence is not my evidence. Your reality tunnel is designed around your anxieties, your desires, your politics, your weak spots. The new pamphlet war isn't fought in town squares. It's fought in private, inside people's heads, one individually targeted narrative at a time. And the deepfake is the perfect weapon for a society that already treats attention as currency. Because once you can generate convincing images, convincing voices, convincing video, the old shortcuts we use to judge truth collapse. I saw it. I heard him say it. There's footage. Those phrases used to function like social glue. Not perfect glue. People have always lied. But glue strong enough to hold a public conversation together. AI dissolves that glue. In the short term, it creates hysteria, sensational fakes, scandal factories, reputations assassinated in seconds. But the longer-term danger is colder. It's what happens after the hysteria, when people get tired, when they're fooled twice, 3 times, 10 times, and then the brain protects itself by shutting down its capacity to believe. That's how truth dies in practice, not by being disproven, by becoming too exhausting to pursue. And when truth becomes exhausting, power offers you a bargain. It says, stop investigating, stop doubting, stop arguing. Just trust us. Trust our badge. Trust our watermark. Trust our official channel. Trust our committee. Trust our fact check. Trust our platform policy. Trust our authorized sources. In other words, hand your judgment back to an institution because the alternative is chaos. This is where the printing press parallel becomes sharp and cruel. The press did help create conditions for later scientific revolutions, but it also created conditions for new gatekeepers, new orthodoxies, new censorship regimes, new punishments for dangerous texts. In information floods, the fight is never simply truth versus lies. It's always also a fight over who gets to decide what counts as truth. So when the script says the 2030s might see stabilization, don't imagine a happy ending where everyone agrees and technology becomes wholesome. Stabilization usually means a new architecture of trust. And architecture is built by whoever has the money, the state power, the platforms, the enforcement mechanisms. Which brings us back to the big question. When society is reborn, who pays the bill? And who gets to call it progress? Because building trust systems is expensive. Someone will fund them. Someone will own them. Someone will benefit from them. And someone will be punished by them. You can already see the outline of the new world. Verified humans as a premium category. Authenticity locked behind paywalls. Identity tied to access. Reputations managed by corporate systems. Dissent labeled as harmful misinformation. And ordinary people pressured to surrender privacy for the privilege of being believed. That is the Renaissance pattern in its darkest form. An explosion of access, followed by a consolidation of authority. So the open loop is brutal and simple. When AI forces us to invent new institutions of verification, will those institutions be designed to protect ordinary people from fraud, or to protect power from accountability by making belief something you can only earn through obedience? If you want to see how power survives an information flood, listen to the language it chooses when it's afraid. In the Middle Ages, if you wanted to be taken seriously, you wrote in Latin. Not because Latin was better, but because Latin was a gate, a credential, a priestly uniform stitched out of grammar. It separated the initiated from the unwashed, the educated from the desperate, the people who could interpret reality from the people who had to accept it. And the most revealing part is this: Latin was already dead. Nobody spoke it to their children. It didn't evolve the way living speech evolves. It was fixed, formal, and, most importantly, controllable. That's what made it useful. A dead language doesn't surprise you. It doesn't develop slang that undermines authority. It doesn't mutate in the mouths of the poor. Then along comes Dante, standing on the threshold between Middle Ages and Renaissance. And he does something that looks obvious now, but was a cultural insult back then. He writes the Divine Comedy in the vernacular, Tuscan, the language of streets, markets, gossip, prayer whispered under breath. He isn't just choosing a different audience. He's declaring that meaning doesn't require permission. And he goes further. He argues the common tongue has a soul because it's natural. It grows. It changes. It belongs to the living. That choice is not just literary. It's political psychology. Because a living language makes a living public. A dead language makes a manageable one. Now look around you and tell me Latin isn't back. It's called corporate English. The phrases are everywhere. Please circle back. Touch base. Moving forward. We take these allegations seriously. Our thoughts are with those affected. It's language designed to sound responsible while saying nothing, to sound human while avoiding risk. It's dead speech, a standardized dialect built for plausible deniability, and it spreads because it's safe. It offends no one, and therefore convinces no one. It fills the air with noise that feels like communication and functions like sedation. And then AI walks in and becomes the perfect priest of this new Latin. Because AI is built to be fluent, smooth, and non-committal. It scrubs out the weird edges that prove a real mind was present. It removes the awkward pause where someone admits uncertainty. It replaces the dangerous sentence, "I don't know," with a confident paragraph that sounds like knowledge. In corporate settings, that's not a bug, it's the product. So here's what happens next, and it's already beginning. Trust migrates away from Polish. Polish starts to smell like automation. Like a script you didn't write. Like an apology you don't mean. When everything can be generated, the most valuable signal becomes the one hardest to fake. A voice that feels lived in. Thick regional accents. Local slang. Unfashionable phrasing. Hesitation. A little mess. A little risk. The kind of speech that cannot be easily standardized without killing the person inside it. This is not just an aesthetic trend, it's a defense mechanism. Because when the information environment becomes toxic, when deepfakes spread, when text becomes cheap, when sources are contested, people start relying on human heuristics. They look for cues. They ask, does this person sound like they have something to lose? Does this person sound like a real neighbor, not a brand? Does this voice carry the weight of a place? And that's where the danger lives. Because power can adapt to vernacular too. It always does. It hires people who can perform authenticity. It trains influencers. It manufactures relatable voices. It creates fake grassroots. It learns the slang. It buys the accent. When you can generate 1,000 voices, you can simulate 1,000,000 locals. AI will not only speak corporate Latin, it will also learn how to impersonate vernacular rebellion. That's the nightmare of the 2030s. Authenticity becomes a commodity, and like all commodities, it gets counterfeited. So what does a society do when both the official language and the rebel language can be generated on demand? It tightens control over identity. This is where you can feel the architecture of the coming decade forming in the dark. Verified humans, proof of personhood, watermarks, biometric trust layers, social platforms that decide who counts as real. And each layer will be sold as safety, protection, stability, the end of chaos. But every layer also becomes a leash. Because the more your ability to be believed depends on credentials, the easier it is to punish you by stripping them. The easier it is to exile you from reality by labeling you unverified, unsafe, misinformation. Latin was never just a language. It was a system for controlling who could participate in truth. Corporate English is the same system, modernized. And AI doesn't just automate the language, it accelerates the entire hierarchy behind it, making it possible for institutions to fill the world with endless official speech while starving real, messy, human voices out of the conversation through sheer volume. So the question sharpens again. If the 2030s become a renaissance of the vernacular, will that vernacular be a genuine return of human soul? Or will it be the final stage of control, where even rebellion is machine-made and sold back to you as a product? There's a reason Renaissance thinkers obsessed over the shape of a human life. They weren't playing philosophy games. They were responding to a world where old certainties were cracking. Plague, war, information chaos, collapsing institutions. When reality turns unstable, people start asking the most dangerous question of all: what am I allowed to become? Enter Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, young, brilliant, reckless, and exactly the kind of person every aging institution hates. He walks into a culture built on hierarchy and fixed roles and says something that sounds spiritual but lands like a weapon. Humans have no fixed nature. A lion must be a lion, a dog must be a dog. But man is unfinished. Man is the creature that can choose. And Pico frames that choice as a ladder. At the bottom, the vegetative life: eat, sleep, consume, endure. Above it, the sensual life: chase pleasure, hunger, status, instinct. And above that, the divine life: create, think, reach for transcendence. You can hear the optimism in it, but don't miss the threat. If humans can choose their level, then power can no longer justify obedience as destiny. If the soul is plastic, the social order is negotiable. That is why humanism was always political psychology. It wasn't just be inspired. It was, you are not what the system says you are. Now put that ladder next to the modern feed. The default setting of our era is the vegetative level. And it's not an insult. It's a design outcome. You don't fall into it because you're weak. You're guided into it because it's profitable. The algorithm doesn't want you awake. It wants you predictable. It wants you in a loop. Scroll, consume, react, repeat. A passive body is easy to monetize. A passive mind is easy to herd. And AI is about to make that loop feel like velvet. Because the feed used to have friction. You could get bored. You could reach the end of what interested you. You could feel the awkward emptiness and maybe turn to your own thoughts. AI removes that. It can generate endless novelty, tuned to your exact cravings. It can create infinite U-shaped content, like a slot machine that never runs out of coins. It can fill every silence with stimulation that feels personal, intimate, even comforting. That is not harmless entertainment. That is a method of control that doesn't need police. Here's the confrontation. In the Renaissance, elites feared the masses might read too much, think too much, become too much. Today, the system fears the opposite. It fears you might stop consuming. Because consumption is docile. Creation is unpredictable. Creation is also costly. It requires time, embarrassment, failure, and failure is exactly what our culture has trained you to avoid. We live under permanent surveillance, maybe not by cameras in every room, but by the possibility of being recorded, clipped, mocked, archived. A generation raised in that environment learns a survival skill. Don't try too hard. Don't risk being seen failing. Wrap everything in irony, because irony is armor. If you pretend you don't care, you can't be hurt. That armor keeps you safe, and it keeps you small. Pico's divine level isn't about becoming an angel. It's about becoming a creator despite the risk of ridicule. It's about the choice to be the one who makes the thing instead of the one who scrolls past it. Bad poetry, off-key singing, a clumsy painting, a messy essay, a community play with terrible lighting. These are not aesthetic luxuries. They're evidence of agency, proof that a consciousness made a choice instead of taking the path of least resistance. AI can imitate the output. It can write the poem. It can generate the melody. It can produce a painting in seconds. But it cannot live what those things are supposed to cultivate. A person who can tolerate uncertainty, who can risk being wrong, who can build skill over time, who can love the process more than the applause. That's why the fight against AI isn't primarily technical. It's moral. It's psychological. It's about what kind of humans we are willing to become in an environment engineered to keep us vegetative. And now the knife edge. If the 2030s really are a renaissance, it won't come from AI doing great things. It will come from humans rejecting a life where the machine makes everything easy, smooth, and meaningless. But rejecting is not free. It requires boundaries, studioli, silence, offline time, communities that reward trying. And those boundaries are political, because once enough people choose the divine level, choose creation over consumption, someone's business model collapses. So here's the open loop that drags us into the next part. If authenticity and creation become the new status symbols, will ordinary people be allowed to choose them? Or will the right to be human become another gated privilege, sold back to us by the same systems that trained us to forget it? A renaissance isn't only a change in tools, it's a change in what a culture allows people to want out loud. Because desire is dangerous when it stops apologizing. Look at our current moment, and you'll notice something rotten under the jokes. We live in an era that punishes visible effort. Cringe is the word we use when we see someone reaching for greatness without protective gloves. It's not really about taste. It's about fear. A generation raised under constant recording learns quickly that sincerity is a liability. Trying hard is evidence. It can be clipped, mocked, replayed, archived. So you build armor. You smirk first. You preemptively call yourself stupid. You wrap ambition in irony because irony lets you retreat without bleeding. That's not a personality quirk. That's a political psychology of surveillance. When people are terrified of being seen failing, they self-censor their own growth, and a population that self-censors is easy to manage. You don't have to crush their will, you just have to make will feel embarrassing. Now pull that thread back into the Renaissance, because this is exactly the kind of psychological atmosphere that Renaissance culture detonated. The Renaissance didn't have our concept of cringe because it didn't have our concept of permanent public ridicule. Yes, people gossiped. Yes, reputations mattered. But the architecture of shame was different. You weren't living inside a global amphitheater where every stumble could become entertainment for millions. And that difference matters, because Renaissance society, especially in elite circles, normalized an idea modern people find almost offensive. You are allowed to proclaim your own greatness. Machiavelli's word, virtu, is often flattened into virtue, which makes it sound like moral goodness. But in his world, it's closer to force of character, audacity, capability, the skill to shape events instead of being shaped by them. It's the quality of someone who doesn't wait for permission. And this ethic didn't just belong to princes. It seeped into art, scholarship, and civic life. Fame, glory, lasting name, fama were treated as legitimate goals, not moral flaws. That's why the Renaissance produces a certain kind of human, the one who makes something and wants the world to know it was him. Imagine Michelangelo hesitating because strangers might roast his Pietà. Imagine he stops halfway through a commission because he's worried the critics will call him try hard. The thought is absurd, not because Renaissance people were braver by nature, but because their culture paid out status for mastery and ambition. It rewarded effort with patronage, commissions, workshops, apprenticeships, civic pride. The system had its own ugliness, power, inequality, exploitation. But the social story was clear. Excellence is not shameful. And that is why Benvenuto Cellini is such a useful mirror. His autobiography is basically a long, unblushing declaration that he is extraordinary. He brags. He argues. He performs the ego of a man who expects to be remembered. You can call it narcissism, and sometimes it is. But it's also evidence of a world where self-belief wasn't automatically treated as a crime. Now snap back to the modern world where even mild ambition gets punished as cringe. This is where the AI flood changes the emotional economy. When machines can generate competent output instantly, competence becomes cheap. And when competence becomes cheap, what becomes valuable is something machines can't generate honestly: commitment, risk. A person staking their identity on a craft over time. A person trying publicly, failing publicly, improving publicly. In other words, the very thing irony has been strangling. That's why you're starting to see hairline cracks in the don't care culture. A celebrity stands up and says, plainly, I take my craft seriously and I want to be great. And people recoil, not because the desire is immoral, but because the vulnerability is unbearable to watch. It forces everyone listening to confront what they've been trained to bury, their own hunger to matter. And that's why the recoil won't last. Irony poisoning is sustainable only as long as the world feels controllable. But when systems decay, when products deteriorate, institutions wobble, truth becomes hard to verify, jobs get reshuffled by automation, people stop finding safety in detachment. Detachment can't build anything. It can only comment while things burn. A renaissance, if it comes, will be a swing back toward new sincerity. Not because everyone becomes nicer, but because sincerity becomes a survival technology. You cannot rebuild a culture on sarcasm. You cannot form a guild, a workshop, a community, a scientific method, a family, a local theatre scene, a real life, if your primary emotional posture is, I'm above caring. Here's the darker edge, though, and it's the part the hopeful version skips. Once sincerity becomes valuable, power will try to bottle it. Because sincerity moves people. It recruits. It creates loyalty. It forms communities that don't rely on platforms. And platforms, like princes, hate any loyalty they don't control. So they will manufacture sincerity the way they manufacture everything else. Influencer templates, authentic brand voices, that learns to stutter and sigh at the right moments. Algorithms that reward the appearance of vulnerability while punishing real dissent. That's the plot turn into the next act. The 2030s may become an era where sincerity returns, ambition returns, the will to create returns. But the battlefield shifts from, are you allowed to care, to something far more brutal. When authenticity becomes the currency, who prints the money? Now we leave the psychology of the individual and step into the economy of the cage. Because irony didn't spread in a vacuum. Detachment isn't just a mood, it's what people do when they feel they don't own their lives. There's a word for what's been happening to modern products and platforms. Enshittification. A crude term for a crude reality. Things get worse on purpose. Not because engineers forgot how to build, but because systems optimized for extraction eventually treat quality as wasted money. At first you get a great service, cheap and generous, because the platform needs you. Then it grows. Then it dominates. Then it starts charging rent. Less value, more ads, more friction in the wrong places, more surveillance, more premium tiers, more little humiliations that remind you who owns the door. Sound familiar? If you were a medieval peasant, you worked land you didn't own and paid rent to a lord who promised protection. Protection from what? Often from other lords. You lived inside a system where your survival required access controlled by someone else. You could be born into debt and die in debt and never touch true ownership. It was normal because it was all you knew. Now look at the modern version. You don't own your music, you access it. You don't own your movies. You stream them until the catalog shrinks, or the ads appear, or the content disappears. You don't own software, you rent it. You don't own the tools of your work, you subscribe. You don't own your attention, you lease it out in exchange for entertainment and then wonder why you feel hollow. The product you bought becomes a service you must keep paying. The service you pay becomes a product stuffed with ads. The ads become a surveillance system. The surveillance system becomes the real business. And you are not a customer, you are a resource. This is not an accident. It's a structure. Once a company has locked you in, your satisfaction stops being the goal. Your inability to leave becomes the goal. That's the difference between a market that rewards excellence and a market that rewards captivity. And captivity is the emotional soil where pessimism grows. Because optimism requires a belief that effort leads to ownership. Ownership of skills, property, tools, time. When people feel they have no stake, they stop building. They stop investing in the future. They retreat into consumption because consumption is the only thing that still feels available. That's why this matters for the new Renaissance argument. The Renaissance, at least in its civic commercial centers, was driven by a mercantile class that believed in tangible results, workshops, guilds, crafts, goods that could be judged and traced and proudly stamped. Quality wasn't just aesthetic. It was reputation. It was survival. Your name was on the cloth. Your guild could punish you if you poisoned the market with shoddy work, not because they were moral saints, but because they understood something we've forgotten. When trust collapses, commerce collapses. When commerce collapses, everything collapses. So here is the confrontation. Our current economy is designed to normalize decline. You pay more and get less. And you're told this is just how things are. That phrase, just how things are, is the feudal spell. It's the same spell that told peasants their place was natural and permanent. A renaissance can't happen inside that spell. A renaissance requires a public that believes improvement is possible, and improvement is difficult to believe when every object around you is designed to rot faster. But the script's point lands here. People are getting sick of it. The exhaustion is becoming visible. Fast fashion falls apart. Electronics become unrepairable. Apps become unusable without subscriptions. Streaming becomes cable again. Bundles, ads, tiers, price hikes. And when people feel squeezed hard enough, they start looking for exits. They start buying used, repairing, owning physical media, supporting local makers, choosing quality not as moral purity, but as self-defense. This is where the optimism tries to re-enter. Because ownership creates responsibility. When you own something, you maintain it. When you maintain it, you care. When you care, you build. And when enough people build, culture stops feeling like a disposable landfill and starts feeling like a city again. But don't let the sweetness fool you. The return to ownership is not guaranteed. And even if it comes, it will be fought. Because rent extraction is not a side effect, it's the business model. The lords of the digital field are not going to surrender steady income because the peasants suddenly read Machiavelli and grew a backbone. They will adapt. They will offer fake ownership. Buy the digital file, but only if you keep an account. Own your device, but only if you accept locked firmware. Own your audience, but only on our platform. They will invent new feudal contracts with modern ink. So, Part 10 ends with a question that decides whether the 2030s become a renaissance or a refined serfdom. If people begin rejecting enshittification and demanding durable human-scale quality again, will markets respond by rebuilding trust and ownership? Or will power simply shift the chains, selling us the feeling of ownership while tightening control over the actual doors? Empires don't collapse the way movies show you. They don't always fall in one clean night of flames and banners. Sometimes they die by paperwork, by debt, by lost faith, by the slow erosion of the one thing that actually holds an empire together, the belief that it is still the center of reality. But 1453 was the version history gives you when it wants to make the lesson obvious. Constantinople falls. The walls are breached. A city that had spent 1,000 years calling itself the continuation of Rome, is suddenly reminded that stone is not destiny. And immediately, the story turns into legend. Byzantine scholars fleeing west with priceless Greek manuscripts, carrying Plato and Homer like rescued saints, injecting lost knowledge into Italy, igniting the Renaissance like a match. There is truth in that image, and also a trap. The truth. Greek learning did flow west, and figures like Bessarion mattered. The Council of Florence, the migration of intellectual networks, the taste for Greek texts, the revival of Plato in certain circles. These were real currents. Libraries were seeded. Collections were built. A new hunger for originals, real originals, became fashionable and then necessary. The trap. The myth that the West was blind until 1453, and then woke up overnight when a handful of scholars arrived with scrolls. That's not how culture works. The Renaissance had roots before the city fell. The West had imperfect access to antiquity through translations, through earlier contacts, through monastic transmission. 1453 didn't create the fire from nothing. It poured fuel on something already smoldering. And that nuance matters, because we're living through a 1453 that won't be dramatic enough to satisfy you. Our Constantinople isn't a single city. It's the idea of legacy authority, the universities that once monopolized prestige, the newspapers that once defined the day's reality, the studio systems that once controlled taste, the institutions that once acted like the official archive of truth. For decades, they were the walls. They were the gatekeepers. They were the Latin. Now, those walls are cracking. Not necessarily because everyone suddenly got smarter, but because the logistics of information changed. The old empire can't move fast enough. Its incentives are wrong. It is bloated, bureaucratic, terrified of risk, addicted to reputation management. And the public can smell fear. That's the poison. Once people suspect an institution is primarily protecting itself, every statement reads like a defense brief instead of a window into reality. So people flee, not physically, like scholars escaping a siege, digitally. They move their attention elsewhere. They build alternate channels, newsletters, podcasts, video essays, communities that feel more human, more local, more accountable. This is the modern manuscript flight, not parchment under the arm, but audiences under the thumb. And like 1453, there's a silver lining that isn't pure. When old empires weaken, new centers can form, new voices can speak, the vernacular rises, the gate loses its lock. But when the gate loses its lock, another problem arrives. The archive becomes contested. Because what is an archive? It's not just a pile of information. It's a decision about what gets preserved, what gets highlighted, what gets taught, what gets forgotten. It's power wearing the costume of memory. And in a world of infinite content, AI content, platform content, disposable content, the archive becomes more important, not less. Because if everything is recorded, then forgetting becomes intentional. If everything is available, then visibility becomes political. The question isn't, can you find the truth? The question becomes, can you keep it alive long enough for it to matter? This is where the new Renaissance argument stops being cute and becomes dangerous. If the 2030s are going to stabilize after the AI-driven flood, stabilization will require new institutions of trust, new ways to prove what's real, new ways to certify identity, new ways to trace sources, new ways to preserve work that isn't machine-generated sludge. And those institutions won't appear like flowers. They'll appear like fortresses, built by someone, funded by someone, enforced by someone. That someone is the heart of the big question. Because the moment you admit we need verification, you also admit someone will control verification. The moment you say we need a trusted archive, you also say someone will decide what enters the archive. And that's the same moment an empire is reborn, not by reclaiming old walls, but by rebuilding control mechanisms in new materials. In 1453, the fall of a center pushed knowledge into new hands. In our era, the fall of legacy centers is pushing attention into the hands of platforms and algorithms, entities with incentives that are not truth, not beauty, not human flourishing, but retention and profit. And now AI threatens to turn those incentives into a total environment. The platform doesn't just deliver culture, it generates it, ranks it, edits it, and replaces it on demand. So what does Renaissance even mean under those conditions? It could mean a genuine rebirth of human craft. Small studios, real communities, local languages, messy authenticity, ownership returning, people choosing Pico's divine level again. Or it could mean something colder. A new empire that doesn't need walls because it owns the air, the feed, the verification layer, the archive, the definition of real. And that is the plot turn that should make you uneasy. 1453 didn't just scatter manuscripts. It proved that when a center collapses, whoever builds the next archive inherits the future. So, as we move toward the final act, we have to ask it plainly. When the old Constantinoples of culture lose their legitimacy, who will build the new libraries of truth? And will those libraries liberate the public, or quietly restore empire under a new name? Every Renaissance has a public face and a private ledger. The public face is marble and genius, paintings, inventions, new literature, new science, new confidence. The private ledger is plague pits, wage caps, propaganda, and the silent violence of systems rewriting the rules while everyone is too exhausted to resist. That's the part we've been circling since part 1. So now we cash the check. Now we answer the big question. When a society is reborn, who pays the bill? And who gets to call it progress? The honest answer is ugly. The bill is almost always paid by ordinary people first, and progress is almost always named by whoever controls the archive. The Black Death didn't ask permission before it rearranged power. It created scarcity, and scarcity briefly gave labor leverage. Then the Crown tried to freeze wages, not because it loved fairness, but because it feared bargaining. That is the pattern. Crisis destabilizes. Survivors negotiate. Power legislates to capture the new terms. If it fails, it reforms. If it succeeds, it calls the result order. The printing press didn't bring instant enlightenment. It brought information war. And in response to that war, society built verification mechanisms, not from purity, but from necessity. Those mechanisms, over time, made certain kinds of scientific progress possible. But they also created new gatekeepers, new orthodoxies, new punishments for those who spoke outside the authorized channels. That is also the pattern. A flood arrives. Chaos follows. Institutions rise, claiming to solve chaos. Some protect the public. Some protect power. Most do both at once. So when the original script tells you the 2030s might be a new Renaissance, it's not wrong in spirit. It's just incomplete in accounting. Yes, AI will likely devalue generic output. Yes, polished corporate speech will start smelling like machine breath. Yes, people will crave vernacular voices, local texture, awkward pauses, real presence. Yes, the desire to be offline may become status, because disconnection becomes the rarest privilege in a world engineered for permanent access. But here is what the hopeful version hides. Every one of those shifts is an opportunity for control. If human becomes scarce, the market will price it. If authenticity becomes valuable, it will be counterfeited and sold. If verification becomes necessary, it will be centralized and weaponized. If people build studio-lie, private rooms the algorithm can't enter, systems will respond by trying to make those rooms expensive, socially penalized, or professionally impossible. Because a person with a door is a person who can refuse. And refusal is the one resource empires cannot tolerate. This is why the real battleground of the 2030s won't be AI versus humans like a sci-fi movie. It will be a fight over attention, the raw material of consent. A fight over archives, the machinery that decides what counts as memory. And a fight over identity, the proof systems that determine who is allowed to be believed. In other words, the Renaissance, if it comes, will not be a gift. It will be a negotiation under pressure. So what does a genuine Renaissance require? One that doesn't simply swap old lords for new ones? It requires boundaries that are not luxury goods. Not just rich people escaping into digital detox retreats while everyone else remains plugged in for survival. It requires public spaces designed for human presence, rather than monetized attention. It requires ownership models that restore stake, repairable tools, durable goods, media you can hold, platforms you can leave without social death. It requires verification systems that are transparent and plural, not single points of control. It requires education that teaches method, not just content. How to read sources, how to doubt fluency, how to resist the comfort of the neat answer. Most of all, it requires Pico's knife, the willingness to choose the divine level, creation, over the vegetative level of endless consumption. That choice sounds personal, like self-help. It isn't. It's a civic act, a political act. Because creators form communities, and communities are the only thing that can bargain with power. Here's the final turn of the blade. The 2030s will not automatically become the new Renaissance because technology advanced. Technology never guarantees human dignity. The 2030s become a Renaissance only if people build structures that protect the soul from being processed. Rooms, habits, laws, and cultures that treat attention as sacred, not extractable. So who pays? We do, unless we refuse. Who profits? Whoever owns the pipes, unless we build new ones. Who gets to call it progress? Whoever controls the archive, unless we insist the archive belongs to the public. That's the resolution. Not hope as a mood, hope as a strategy. And now the last question is yours, because history doesn't end with a narrator's speech. It ends with choices. Will you live in the feed like a tenant, paying rent in attention, or will you build a door, reclaim your mind, and become the kind of human an empire can't easily use?